All right, we should be recording now. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the day on early modern world economics and politics, mostly focusing on absolutism. If we were in class, I would ask you guys to take 10 minutes to write about this from your reading. I toyed with doing it here, but it felt like there was already enough stress for everyone to figure out how to get on Zoom. So for today, I'm not going to ask you to do that, but this was the kind of question I would have asked, which was actually pretty closely related to one of the study questions on the Boozbeck document. We'll come back around and talk about it in a minute, but just to sort of set up, because we're so new in class together, you can get the format that I would have done. From this, I think I have a hard time seeing the chat. So, but hopefully everyone's still following along. I don't see anything in the chat. Okay, so I want to talk about the reading for today, but before we do that, I want to set a little context with you guys and just think about economics. I think economics is important. And I think we'll talk later about whether economics is the main thing that matters, like Karl Marx thinks, but that's probably a few weeks off. But when we think about what the world is like in 1500, I know that you guys remember from our last class, as we start our semester, China is the most powerful place in the world. We'll come back and visit and talk about Kangxi in a minute. And tied for second are the Mughal Empire and the Ottoman Empire, which we spent a lot of time with already in the Renaissance's class. And Europe is really scrambling behind. And so I want to think about that in terms of trade. I think a lot of this is intuitive or you've actually already learned it. But this map might help you see everybody's trying to get to the Indian Ocean basin. This area, I'm kind of moving my arrow around so you can see where the Mughal Empire is in yellow. But during the course of the certainly 1500s, 1600s, into the early 1700s, a lot of different European places, you can see by the color coding here, are showing up in this area to try to trade. The trick is that the Europeans don't really have a lot of products that others want. So they're showing up in this area wanting to trade, but they're trying to figure out what it is that other people might want. I'll show you in another map the kinds of things they want back, so we can think about it. But the rest of the world, even early in our semester, is going to start having to figure out how to respond to the European needs and how to adapt and what they're going to be willing to trade or not. In general, these major powers are not threatened by Europeans showing up. The Mughals kind of don't care. The Ottomans don't care. The Chinese, right? Come or go, but they're not threatened in the same way they will be heading into the 18 and 1900s. The main story, I think, of course, in 1492, right? Columbus thinks he's getting to India. That's why he calls them Indians when he shows up in the Bahamas. And so look at this map. Some of this stuff I know you already know. But if you can kind of zoom in a little, or if you want to download it from Folio, you can get a sense for the kind of exchange. And historians like calling this the Columbian Exchange, named after Columbus, because of course, Columbus is showing up with new things from Europe and Africa in the quote New World, right? But in return, right, the New World's also introducing Eurasia with products and animals and crops and diseases that didn't exist before. In class, I think we could have a nice conversation about this. Maybe I'll let a few of you jump in if you're comfortable with looking at this list. Maybe what surprises you that's on this list? Maybe going, what's Europe bringing from Europe, Asia, and Africa to the New World and the trade? Are there things on there that surprise you? Anyone want to just unmute for a second and see how that goes? Yeah, Juan.
So I'm looking at the list and I'm seeing like tropical fruits coming from Eurasia and Africa and America, like bananas, coconuts, and stuff along the coffee. Wouldn't that have been more prevalent coming from like South Central America versus European countries?
So those are actually things you're looking at the list, the bananas are, you're looking at the list from Eurasia. Yeah, those are things that actually aren't growing at all in the New World until after 1492.
So like for example, like these tropical fruits, lemons and stuff like that, those aren't coming naturally from like South America.
No, they're brought there, and they're coming not necessarily only from Europe, although lemon's also from Europe. But coffee and stuff like that is coming from also from Africa, from over also in farther parts of Asia. Yeah, so that's kind of an exciting thing to notice. If you also look, besides the crops, if someone else wants to unmute for a second. There's also a list of animals. Did you notice?
I was gonna say the diseases. I thought you were going towards the diseases. I was about to say there's different diseases that cross-contaminated when they went over there.
Yeah, thanks, Kaylee. I think probably most famously is smallpox, because the Europeans, the explorers who come over, they've already built up immunity, but no one in the New World has been exposed before, so it's really devastating. A lot of the natives, Native Americans, Indians, as right Columbus calls them, in North America, Central America, and South America, right, are devastated by the diseases that come. At first, it's accidental. I think there are, of course, incidents of someone putting smallpox on a blanket deliberately in a sort of a genocide manner, but in general, those are diseases that are spread just by the fact that there's no immunity there. Yeah, diphtheria is on the list, measles, meningitis, typhus, whooping cough, malaria, influenza. In return, thank you, Americas, they sent syphilis back over. So they do have some vengeance on the other side. I didn't want to just call out the animals. I mean, the animals really fast.
I was really surprised horses were actually transferred over to the New World.
Yeah, thanks, Kalis. I feel like we think a lot about, especially in old like cowboy western kind of cowboy Indian movies, right? Indians are always on horses, and a lot of their culture, right, is horses. But in fact, when the Europeans show up with them, Cortez arrives in Mexico, and the Aztecs call them flying deer. Like they can't figure out what they are, because like they look a little bit like something they know, but not. Yeah, so when we think about this exchange, it's not just, oh, great, a new fruit, right? It's also like a whole new way of life. I mean, having horses is going to really change the way you do things. I don't know if they're on this exact list, but yeah, it's not typed here. But from the Americas, their only like domesticated animal that's natural, like that was long standing in the Americas, was the llama, who's just like not as useful as a horse. You can also see on there chickens, right? So that's a totally different like food to eat, eggs to eat, right? Sheep are on there. That's a very different kinds of domesticated animal. Pigs, so, and I think, and cattle, right? So like your whole world is going to change if you're someone who used to wander around. Now you have oxen that can plow your field or something, right? So you can see, and this is not like instantly as soon as Columbus shows up, right? This is over the 150 years afterwards. But I think it's really useful to think about. I also kind of wonder, like, what was Italy doing without tomatoes? But those come from the New World, and all the stuff we think of for Thanksgiving foods, right? So those are on the list too: potatoes, pumpkins, squash, sweet potatoes, turkey. That comes from the New World. So anyway, just take some time to think about that a little bit. I think it's an old story, but you can think about it in a new way. Okay, so I mentioned before that everyone wants to get to the Indian Ocean basin, and the Europeans don't have much to trade, but silver actually becomes their major international commodity, and in large part, it's from the silver mines that exist, especially in like in Mexico, in Central America, and in South America. This is a drawing from the era, from the late 1500s, of Potosi, which is still today an active silver mine, which is kind of impossible to imagine. Sometimes you hear in the news workers are striking, or there's a mine collapse, or something really awful in Bolivia. But they're mining this silver, and basically, especially the Spanish, Columbus is Italian, but sailing for Spain. The Spanish who stake claim to a lot of this. I mean, they're literally just like sailing off with boatloads of free money because the silver is coming. The government's taking a percentage up to 20%, just like we get 20% of whatever comes out of the ground. And then they're trading it right all across the world. And so it's a really great example to think about. Yes, we have a global economy today, global connections, but back then as well. So silver that would come out of the mine in Bolivia would maybe go walked across with llamas across, the coast, and then sail by ship to Spain, and then be minted into coins, and then be sent off probably over into the Indian Ocean, Asian area. The Chinese government had made a law around this time that taxes had to be paid in silver, which is lucky for the Europeans who have access to lots more silver mines. Silver had been coming a lot from Japan. But so now all of a sudden the Europeans have something that everybody else wants. This map shows you what the Europeans want and actually what they're all trading with each other. And these are maybe familiar things for you. Like we call it China sometimes, right? But porcelain, so like ceramics, spices. It's interesting. They have like a chili pepper logo here. I think probably more like a nutmeg logo or a cinnamon stick might be even more apt for all the spices that are coming. Silks and other kinds of cotton and textiles up and down the Ganges River and over around India. Tea, you can see from China, and copper and gold all the way up from Japan, and then opium kind of across the region as well. So the Europeans want all this high quality, exotic, good stuff. And now they have the silver to be able to do it. All right, I see you guys. Oh, good. Why wasn't the trader? Oh, the Silk Road. The Silk Road's actually, thank you for mentioning, the Silk Road is actually on land. Sorry, I didn't mean to go backwards. Let's see if I can figure out. The Silk Road is actually across China, in towards the Ottoman Empire through India. That's a little bit more of like a Civ 1 kind of thing, a World History 1 moment. So a lot of this is sea trade, like we saw the routes from before, although there's of course also land trading as well, but less so for the Europeans to take part. Anyway, I just want you to think about like all that stuff we're talking about with the Renaissance, right? All the art and the architecture, like that's at this exact same time. It's like, meanwhile, there's all this trading going on. And then for next class, we'll be like, meanwhile, there's all these scientific inventions going on. So all of these things are overlaid on top of each other. Okay, so I'm gonna just pause for a second. Yeah, art, yeah, trade of art as well, right? So I'm just trying to catch up with the chat at the same time. Let's move on to politics, which is of course interrelated with economics. And our main theme for today, I'm going fast, but I think you have the general gist, is to think about absolutism. Absolutism or absolute monarchy, those are synonyms. We've already talked, I think, pretty obviously about how the art and the architecture patronage shows us something about who's got the power, who's controlling what in especially the Ottoman Empire, Mughal India. Today we'll look a little bit at Qing China. This is also true for Russia and France as well. This is a picture of Louis XIV. You guys didn't read about Louis, but I'm going to bring him up as like the example for European monarchs. He's particularly powerful. He's ruling almost the exact same time as Kangxi, whom you read about with the Maxims. So they're contemporaries at the same time. Louis is interesting to remember. He said kind of famously, "I am the state." Right? I am France. So his vision of monarchy is that he personifies France. And so we have to think about like what leads someone to think about that, what makes you an absolute monarch. I'm thinking that as Americans, I think we're not naturally supportive of absolute monarchy. We should be suspicious of absolute monarchy. But at the time, in this early modern world, absolute monarchy is the norm. It's the standard. And I guess if all of us could be absolute monarchs, like maybe we would prefer it. But it's very much the standard kind of government at this time period. But when we think about absolute rulers, I think with our cultural memory, we might think more of dictators like Hitler or Stalin. And that's not really what these positions are, how they're conceived in this era, in the 15, 16, 17, and even into the 1800s in some places. You get power to be an absolute monarch if your father or your grandfather had power to be an absolute monarch, right? It's dynastic. Occasionally there's a woman who steps in, but for the most part, right, it's father, son, father, son. And so part of the goal baked into that system is that you want to pass along to your child a strong, healthy state, right? You don't want to destroy it the way I would say Hitler and Stalin destroyed their countries, right? So they want to strengthen the power of the dynasty. And so how do you do that? Right? You maintain a strong military, right? You don't want to be invaded and weakened, right? And you maintain a strong economy. So the theory of absolutism is that you will do the things in the long-term best interest of your country. That you will want your country to be glorious and wealthy and peaceful and profitable, right? So that then you leave behind this legacy of a job well done for the next generation. We'll talk more about this, but I want to make sure y'all get that down. Let me pause because I've gone now for 15 minutes without asking for questions. If you have a question, do you want to unmute and just ask it? Because I'm not sure I'm going to see hands raised unless you happen to be in my front part.
I got a question. So the absolutism, so you were saying the goal is to strengthen the power of the dynasty, maintain military and economic. Is absolutism like the foundation to all different governments types? Because I mean, democracy is obviously very different, but at the base, isn't that what, for example, our new president, that's the goal, is to strengthen the country by having a stronger military, economic, and strength of within the country. So sounds like it's like the base of every other government that's gonna, go their little separate ways, but they all have the same idea.
That's a really great framing. Yeah, what makes absolutism absolute? So you're right, all governments should want to do this. An absolute monarch has no legal checks on their power. So I'm glad you bring up compared to the American system, right? Which is we have a strong executive, but with absolutely the wrong word, with very strong checks, right? So we'll talk more about America with the revolution, but certainly with the executive branch strong, but then also there's a legislative branch and a judicial branch, right? In America, in an absolute system, in Louis France, in Suleiman's Ottoman Empire, in Kangxi's China, there are no formal checks on their power. There's no legislative checks. There's no constitution. There's tradition, right? There's things we expect to happen, but there's no kind of legal recourse other than like a rebellion or a revolution. Does that help kind of, but I think you're right that all governments, of course, want that package deal. So thank you for that one. Other thoughts or questions?
Do you feel like I like what he was saying about the goal and how all governments are similar in that way? Is that really like limited to governments that have a formation of a state that want to seize like absolute power and like kind of like a centralized government too?
Yeah, so you want a strong centralized government, and we'll talk about kind of how you consolidate your power, because obviously to be an absolute monarch, in 1550 is going to be really different than 1850, than 1950, than right, in terms of what you have access to do. Yeah, so it's not just about leadership, although I think that's part of it. It's about a structural system, right, that recognizes that the children and grandchildren of the ruler become the ruler. That dynastic part is it for monarchy means like the kingdom. So I think that's important. But we'll, at the end of the day today, we'll talk about Hobbes and Locke and challenges to absolutism, right, and what other systems people are kind of carving out. So thanks, Tyson. We'll get there. Okay, so just a quick recap, right? So we already met Suleiman before. We talked about his mosque. So now you guys have read, especially about Roxolana, who's such an interesting figure, although we're hearing about her through a European, right, who's seeing it. So we've got some filters here. We don't have her own story. But what are these stories? And let me ask just for a couple of comments. What are the stories about Roxolana and the death of Suleiman's son and grandson, right? What do they reveal about his power, about what it means to be the Sultan, which is the name of the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, right? So we drew conclusions through the art and architecture. Now what do we draw through these stories?
I don't have a comment on it, but I kind of have a question.
Okay.
Because you were just talking about how like this is what they're like, the absolute monarchy, and that's what they're doing right now, and it's you want to set the empire up for the next generation. Why kill your oldest son? I'm kind of confused on that part, because when I was reading the article and I read through that part, I was like, hold on, they have this where it goes down from like father to son, it's passed on. So how and why, I guess, why was she so effective? Like, why did she affect that so much into having his son was executed, having his grandson executed for her kids?
Yeah, let me stop sharing so we can kind of see each other a little bit better if you put yourself on gallery view. Yeah, who wants to jump in? Who's got a response?
I do.
Um,
Oh,
Jake?
sorry, go ahead.
well, it says that like the women who have children with men in the Turkish Empire are granted rights, and the children of those women, no matter how many concubines or other wives that the men have, are granted free rights and equal and all treated the same. So the Sultan had many different children with many different wives, but all of those children, there is no like favorite because they're all considered equal.
But
So
it
then,
said that he took her as a wife, that he hadn't taken anyone
yeah,
else other than her.
yeah. So that's where the story got a little bit.
That's where it differs.
That's where like
why is this?
that's where she comes into play as like this historical figure because she like almost kind of schemed her way into being his wife after
Certainly,
she
Buzbek thinks she has, right? I mean, certainly
right. Yeah,
the
from the
guy
letters.
looking in from the outside, right, feels
Yeah.
obviously suspicious of her for sure.
Yeah, because she was foreign, which made her
So she's
mystique
saying,
even
yeah.
larger. But once she had a child with the Sultan, she was granted her freedom and then basically demanded to be his wife, and he obliged.
So I think so like the big picture in a little bit. I think it's a great answer, and I think it's a good question. I think if we look at like, okay, what does this tell us? It tells us that even though there are no checks formally, there are customs, right? Now the Sultan can break the customs whenever he wants, but everyone's going to notice and think it's weird, right? So I think what we're seeing is that there is a system in place, there is expected things, but there's also room, of course, for the absolute ruler to do whatever the absolute ruler wants. And so I think that's I think in some ways what Buzbek is highlighting, is that we're seeing some of that. Corey has a formal hand up. Yeah, perfect.
Sorry,
Nope, is the
I
hand.
can't really use my audio for too long because I have a lot of pets. They're being nice for like right this second,
Just
but
tell, yeah, then just tell us your
film it.
quick question. Go, or comment.
I think that this story was really reflective on the point that women didn't have direct power. They could use the power structure to benefit them and their future children. Because while I was reading, wasn't, oh golly, I don't know how to pronounce his name. The Sultan's son that got killed.
Okay.
From the sounds of it, that wasn't her child. That was a sultan with a
No,
different
it's definitely not her
costume.
child for sure. Yeah, no, she's definitely not killing her.
So she didn't really have the power to be like, well, my children should rule. She had the power to use advisors, presumably a man, to influence the other man, the sultan, to think in a certain way, to make
Yeah.
sure her kids were
Okay.
gonna rule.
So I think brings us to another big picture point, which is, yes, an absolute monarch has no checks on their power, but an absolute monarch has advisors. Maybe informal advisors, maybe formal advisors, but he's got Rustin, right? He's got kind of like the chief of staff role, right? Also, he's got wives or personal, maybe in other years it's an uncle, or maybe it's a, brother or whatever. I don't know, all the brothers are dead. Maybe it's someone else, right? So that there's room for advisors even within this absolute system. But it's still, he has the final say, right? He could say, no, I'm not killing my child. No, I'm not approving this of my grandson, right? Buzbek thinks he's been kind of hoodwinked in a way, which I think does speak to this issue of what kind of influence or power can women find, which I think is not a secondary issue, like an allied issue with what's going on. Did someone else want to jump in? I think Reagan, you had wanted to say something. Did we cover your points, or do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting how this kind of speaks to the greed of the system, or specifically like to the greed of man, because you take someone as your wife because you want to keep them like suppressed and as your slave, but you've treated her as a slave for years until, she says, I'll be obedient to you until you make me your wife. Of course, after being oppressed by the same person for so long, like in some, it wasn't necessarily revenge, but in some ways you try to seek security wherever you can in the broken system. Like it shows that I feel like there's more like loopholes or issues with this kind of system because there's less decision, less people. less
Yeah.
representation.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, which is that when we talk about absolutism, and even when we talk about dictatorship, right? Even when we get into the 20th century, we talk about, living in Mussolini's fascist Italy or something, right? There's nothing, no ruler is as powerful as they want to be, right? That there's always room, there's always maneuvering, there's always something out of their control. And I think that's important to notice as well. Drake's got an answer in the chat too, right? To think some more, about how do we frame this, right? So we care about Roxolana. She's a fascinating, interesting story, right? We care about Suleiman and the Ottoman Empire, but we also care about kind of what does this tell us writ large about this absolutism in practice, right? What is it like to live in an absolute monarchy, to be the ruler, to be in the orbit, right, of an absolute monarch? So I think it's just another way. We talked last class about art as a source, like painting, sculpture, architecture as a historical source. So here we have letters as a historical source. I mean, in a way, gossip as a historical source, because that's kind of what Busbek is doing. He's like, can you believe these crazy Ottomans? What a story. So the different ways we can kind of get at what is going on in these places, and how do we know what it's like to live there. Let me go back to the screen share, and let's look at the other source too, because I don't want to leave you guys out of things. I've got still the gallery up a little bit, but maybe if I do it a little smaller, that might be easier. Okay, so we've got Suleiman, just a quick reminder, right? We've got Mughal India. We don't have more primary sources about Jahangir, but we have the fact that he's organizing this whole painting workshop. He's deciding who gets to work there and what they're producing. He's the one with the cultural fusion message with the world's largest mural, creating this giant city, right? So the power to control culture should be part of this definition as we try to craft understanding of what's going on in absolutism. Let's turn to China and Kangxi, the XI. Is because we're obviously changing it from Chinese letters to our alphabet. So Kangxi is ruling really almost at the exact same time as Louis. And I gave you guys just the list of these 16 kind of rules, which were posted all over China during his reign. Chinese history is measured up until 1911 is measured in dynasties. So it's what is the family that rules. Some of the families rule for a very short time. Some of the families rule for a very long time. So hundreds of years in a row. And so Chinese history, if you had like a Chinese history textbook, it would be about dynastic cycles. The dynasty comes and what are they doing? And then how do they kind of fall out of favor? There's some kind of revolution or coup or invasion from outside, and then another dynasty comes. So we're focusing on the Qing dynasty. So look back at these maxims. I asked you guys to look them over, and let's have another kind of conversation. Kangxi and the Qing dynasty, they're actually outsiders. They are sometimes called the Manchu. They're not ethnically Chinese, ethnically Han in the same way. And so they've got to come in kind of like the way that Babur and the Mughals have to come into India and set themselves up as like, we're outsiders who now want to rule. So he has a particular task ahead of himself. So let's think about the maxims. So what do those tell us about life under Kangxi? What is it like to live? What kind of power does the emperor have in early modern China?
I think one of the more interesting ones is number 10.
Okay, now I should have not stopped the share. Okay, but go ahead.
Oh, sorry. It's let each work at his own occupation so that the people's mind will be settled. And I think that's just an interesting idea for an absolute monarchy. Usually you would think the monarch's trying to control everybody doing everything, so they want people to report back to people instead of just let the farmers farm and let the people write and let the people exist as long as the job is done. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Thanks, McKinley. Anyone else want to jump in on any of these?
Seems a lot of
Oh, sorry, I should do it.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say a lot of them are like really seem to be like guidelines of how to live, almost like the 10 Commandments as well. These ones really seem like they give you a list of guidelines to follow to have a better and more fulfilling life, and also how to make a better society as well.
This is a very good point. Thank you. Yeah, that they go well beyond the scope of like pay your taxes on time, right? That they are kind of how to be a good human, how to lead a fulfilling life. Juan, you were going to jump in, right?
Yeah, so I was gonna say, if you look at the Chinese guidelines essentially for the time, like think about the religious point of view that they had. Like this, their guidelines are more of like a you find your peace, don't harm the next guy, and it kind of goes on par with the religious point of view that they have. If they're having a form of Buddhism, it's a lot of find your peace, don't disturb the next, versus in the Ottoman Empire where you have Islam or Christianity, it's a very controlling point of view, like convert the next guy, make him view what you view, versus the China might have a little bit more of a, hey, find your peace, don't disturb the next guy, and follow these guidelines, but there's not such a strict religious control versus these Western, a little bit more West than where this region is.
That's a great point. So I put in the chat just a reminder about Confucianism. Also, you mentioned Buddhism, which I think is really helpful. Confucianism, I don't think is even a religion, right? Buddhism is, but Confucianism is this same time kind of coming. Confucius lives at the same time as like Aristotle and Plato. So a very ancient wisdom. He's a teacher like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. And so these ideas become like, in order to get ahead in Chinese society, under this emperor system, like to get a position in the court, you have to pass the test that proves you know a lot about Confucianism. And you're absolutely right, Juan, to delineate what's going on in Asia from what goes on in the Middle East and the West with the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They're all pretty confident that they've got the answer, right? There's one answer, there's one God, we got it. And if you don't have it, you're wrong. Right? That's not at all the tradition of Hinduism and Buddhism and Confucianism. So that spiritual control is sort of missing there, which I think is what one is jumping in on as well. Yeah. So like how to be a good Confucian, Drake. I think you're right about that. Other comments? Is there anyone else who wants to jump in? I can get back to the screen share if.
Out of the all list that I see, one that kind of stood out to me was preventing the young people from like doing wrong things and kind of encouraging them towards like education to get more educated and kind of promote the scholarly tradition, so that way they can gain more education and kind of be a better citizen under his monarchy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this was an excellent point because China is a very vast empire. Like we said, it's the wealthiest, most organized, strongest military. And theoretically, like in theory, just like America, right? In theory, anyone can rise up, right? Anyone can take that Confucian exam, pass it, and get a good job in the government. Right. In reality, the farmer's kid might not have the same chance as the Confucian scholar's kid, right? Who's grown up with it, but it's an open system to promote merit, to promote people being educated. And Confucianism also has a lot of rules or precepts, recommendations, like you guys pointed out about like know your place, know your job, be good at your job. Don't worry about other people's job, right? So you be the best father you can be. You be the best son you can be. You be the best brother you can be. Same thing if you switch genders, right? And then all of China will be great, right? Because all of us will be fulfilling kind of who we are supposed to be in the most harmonious way. And so that's part of it. And so he wants to rule over, everyone else is autonomously, like the emperor's gonna be the best emperor it can be, and you're not going to question the emperor. You're going to do your thing. I'm looking to a couple more comments here. China's strong. Yeah, Confucianism. Yes, exactly, Drake. Confucianism sticks around really until the 20th century, China, till finally kind of has exploded, which we'll get to at the end of the semester, right? Yeah, decreasing rebellion. Rule number 7, Beverly, let me go back to screen share and we can look at that one together. Beverly wants us to look at, oh yeah, okay, right, yeah, exalt orthodoxy means doing things the traditional way, right? Don't question. Thank you, Beverly, that's a great one to point out. Because China's already so strong, they're not interested in new ideas. They're not interested in innovation. They already did it, check, we're done, we're amazing, we're the top. Which I think makes sense in 1722, right? It's not going to make sense in 1822. It's definitely not going to make sense in 1922, right? When everyone around you is also changing. So again, just another kind of source that we can look at to think about absolute power. Just in general, maybe we can look at this picture of Kangxi to do our art analysis, right? There's other pictures I could have taken to show you all. There's pictures of him on a horse, whatever. I like this one because I think it shows us him at his most majestic. He has this beautiful textile silk, intricately woven outfit on, right? Instead of a crown like we think of, right? But he has a very particular hat on, which is like a crown that we might be used to in the Western tradition. The very patterned floor, right? The beautiful chair that he's on. So he's like sitting there looking very majestic, very glorious, gold, right? Very wealthy. And he is ruling at a time and consolidating power. The Qing dynasty has come in and taken over. He's expanded the borders, but he's kept things safe. And he's led a couple of successful wars. And so I think he's looking very regal here, like a statesman in this particular image. If we think back, he and Louis are at the same time. He's the most powerful in the most powerful place, ruling in a place that has had absolute rulers for 2,000 years or more, 3,000 years. That's not the case in France. Louis is trying to establish some new precedents. He's trying to expand his power. China's kind of isolated, right? They're kind of in control of the whole region with not very many enemies. France is surrounded by sibling rivalry, right? And lots of squabbles among different territories. They both are good at building up a bureaucracy, building up what we would think of as like middle class, like worker bees who can follow directions and make a bureaucracy function. And so in that sense, their reigns are similar. The power structure is similar, but like Kangxi is on this huge scale, like in gesture, and Louis is dealing with a much smaller, kingdom. These aren't the only examples, but I think it's like now we've got, I think, enough examples to agree that there's a pattern. Just a few more things. I thought these are kind of like memorable ways to think about absolutism, even to the point of trying to control your hair. So before the Qing, before the Manchus came in, Kangxi's family was the Ming dynasty. And so this is just a sample from a textbook that was the kind of standard hairstyle for men, long, uncut, and bound, right? And these were what some of the virtues were. The Qings come in, the Manchus have a different hair tradition. So even just by the way you wear your hair is a sign of like, are you on board with the new ruling family or not? And to get you to change your hair, right, is about submitting to this new authority. Similarly, in Russia, we also have absolutism. Peter the Great is there. There's a picture of him. Russians almost always have beards, in part because it's so cold, right, in Russia. And Peter goes to visit France, and he travels around Europe, and he notices that many other places beards are not fashionable. So he gets back and decides he doesn't want beards anymore in Russia. Obviously, not everybody agrees, and so he ends up having to set up like a beard tax. So if you want to have a beard in Peter the Great's Russia, you just have to pay a little extra. But that's the level of the kind of control, the cultural dominance that these guys are expecting to, and occasionally women, Catherine the Great, but mostly men are trying to exert. So just kind of a fun, I don't know, other way to think about it. So we can sum up. Here's just an image of one of the Mughal emperors. So let's sum up kind of what are the aspects of absolute rule. I saw a question in the chat. How is it different than democracy? It's just the exact opposite of democracy, because democracy is the idea that all the people have equal say. At any one given time, you might elect someone, a congressperson or a senator or a mayor or a president, but that person is fundamentally not more equal than you, right? The deals were all, they're representatives of you, and then they step back out when they're out of office. An absolute ruler presents themselves, if it's women, as fundamentally different. For Chinese rulers, they say they're ruling with the mandate of heaven. The gods have chosen them. Louis XIV is going to talk about divine right of rule, right? God chose me and my family, right? We're not regular people. We're something very different. So I've just got a list here. I didn't have that comment on there on the PowerPoint just because I didn't anticipate it. But one of the ways to keep control of your people, is when they're unhappy, you can fight a war. And win, obviously, and that makes you prestigious. So sometimes we see a lot of absolute rulers. Certainly, they want a strong army, and frequently they may be at war. Controlling the trade. So not only do they have control over the culture, maybe even your beard length, but they also have control of who gets to trade what, or who they're approving of trading. Like I mentioned with Kangxi, like you may have noticed with Louis, many absolute rulers are very interested in images of strength and majesty, because it's kind of a sham that they rule, right? Like they rule because everyone lets them. And so you want to have the biggest castle with the most horses, or the fittest bodyguards, right? The biggest house parties, the most elaborate chandelier, the biggest feasts, whatever, right? Because you want it to be unquestioning that you're the leader. And so there's a lot of PR, public relations, like comms messaging going on by these rulers all the time. When Louis is little, he becomes king, but there's a push by some other nobles to be in charge. He survives it, but he never forgets it. And so he's always insecure that he wants to make sure he's extra grandiose, right? So that no one else will cross him. Like I mentioned before about the bureaucracy, that's a word we think of probably with, like, if you go to the DMV, right, or the IRS, right, when you've got to like pay your car tax or something. But all of these guys at different scales, right, are expanding the government's involvement, like the maxims, right, the government's involvement in your daily life. In many ways, that's more fair because you know what's expected of you, right? Go to the DMV, there's a certain driving test we all have to take. It's not that some people who are friends with the mayor take a different driving test, right? So when you codify things, when you have government rules, when you have a set taxes, right? Everybody knows what the system is. Even if it feels unfair, at least you know what it is. And I think that's in some ways an advantage, certainly of absolute rule compared to like an anarchy, right? Where you don't know what's going to get you killed or or how to get protection. So there's clear cut rules enforced by the bureaucracy. I hope I'm not going too fast. Okay. Yes, we're gonna get there. And also you want to keep peace at home, right? Of course. So you don't want your people being invaded. You don't want to be killing people on the street corners, right? You want them to prosper and feel like they can invest in their business and life. All right. If you have questions, maybe stick them in the chat. I'm gonna move on because I want to talk and set us up for the French Revolution, basically, thinking about limits on monarchy. So this is absolutism is the standard. But England is an example that doesn't buy in. And so we see in the 1600s, I want to zoom in on England in particular, who is, of course, the godfather of America, right? So for our system comes out of this system, and think about what's going on in England. There's a lot of history that I don't want to go into, but I want you just to trust me. There's a lot of political turmoil in England in the 15 and 1600s. And there's a civil war. And the king's trying to be more powerful. There's already a legislature, like a Congress, it's the parliament. Parliament's challenging the king, and they end up in a civil war. And this king loses. That's in the mid 1600s. And so the kings after that are like, okay, I can't cross parliament, right? Because that happened last time we had a civil war. So both the kings themselves and the people, through a couple generations, say we want a monarch, but we want a monarch who's limited by tradition, limited by the parliament, right? Limited by what we would say the legislative branch, right? They don't have a constitution in the same way, but they've got a Magna Carta, but they don't have a document like we do. But anyway, thinking about that. So while political philosophers are living through all this time, Locke and Hobbes, I'm thinking of, that you guys read the second half of your reading for today. And they're starting to think about government as a contract. And so I want to just like pan out and think about, okay, why do we form a government? Like I mentioned anarchy before, right? Like, why don't we all just live like cave people, running around in the forest, hiding out in caves? Why do we come together to live as a society? And so it's not just thinkers in England, thinkers elsewhere as well. Rousseau, we're going to get to, thinks about it a lot too. But so they imagine that government's a contract. This is an imaginary thing. This is not like a true thing, but they imagine that cave people came together and said, okay, we would like to form a government. Why do we want a government? What do we want out of it? Like, what's the deal? What's the agreement? A contract, right, is an agreement between two parties. And so they imagine, what is life like with no government? And Locke especially talks about this. Well, Hobbes especially too, both of them. What is life like? So they imagine if you're born in total freedom, you're born not part of a government, not in a country, like not with a passport, right? You're a cave person equivalent. And they call that the state of nature. I think you can think about that also when we think about human nature, right? What are humans really like? What are we naturally like? Okay, like a secret. Hobbes and Locke don't know anything you don't know. So you can disagree with them, right? They're going to tell you what they think human nature is like, but you can feel free to disagree. Be like, no, humans are like this. So I'm not telling you what humans are like, because I think that's a debatable thing. But they imagine what is life like. And so we'll come up with their answers in a minute, but just the thinking about it. So they say people choose to come together, right? They're going to form a civil society, and they're going to give up some rights, right? Because I can't live in total freedom. If I'm a cave person, I can steal whatever I want, take whatever I want, cut down whatever tree I want, plant whatever I want, right? Kill whatever I want. But now if I'm living together in a community, I'm not going to be able to do everything I want the minute I want to do it, right? But I'm going to get some benefits from that. Then I'm maybe not going to be killed randomly, right? My tree is not going to get cut down by my neighbor, right? Once we have the rules. So social contract theorists imagine that there's a contract between the ruler and the ruled, between us cave people and whoever we choose. Do we choose a democracy, like a representatives? Do we all make all the decisions exactly equally? Do we pick one person whose kid is then going to be in charge of us in the next generation? Like whatever we decide, right? But there will be a ruler and there'll be ruled people. Okay, so what are you giving up to be part of that? And that's going to be where theorists disagree. I'm not going to stop share, but I just want to ask really fast if anyone has questions. I see 4 things in the chat. Let me look at those. All right, let's not get to those points yet. Let me think. Okay, other questions. I'll be quiet for a second. Let me go backwards. Does anyone have a question about that, or does that all sound? If you've taken a political science class before, or American government, you may have already talked about this idea of the social contract. All right, so let's think about Locke and Hobbes in particular. So Thomas Hobbes, they both live in like modern day Britain. They're both writing in English. Hobbes writes this book Leviathan, which you read samples of, right? And Hobbes is like, you know, a guy in a study with his quill pen writing things down. So Hobbes has lived through the Civil War, is pretty chaotic. It's kind of a disaster, right? And so he's thinking, why, like once you make that contract, why would you break that, right? What's the reason why you'd break that? So he's trying to think about what's at stake in this contract. So look at your reading. I don't have the zoom in, but look at your reading and maybe someone can tell us, what does Hobbes think life is like in the state of nature? And this is among his most famous ideas. What is it like if you have no government controlling you? No agreement, no system of government.
It says it's like a state of war.
Yeah, the state of war. Will you read us a little bit more from that passage? Or are you just looking at your notes, which is fine too?
I was looking at my notes.
Yeah, so if life is like, if it's a state of war in cave people, what is that? What does Hobbes think people are really like then?
So he might think that people are just constantly in a state of, like you were saying before, if there's no order, I can just kill who I want, cut the tree I want. And if I'm constantly in that state of alert, like if I go outside, I have to be on alert that my neighbor might be out here trying to kill me to get what I got. So that constant state of alert can put you in a sense of, instead of peace and calm, it's chaos, and that's going to bring more spouts of anger, more spouts of negative action, versus I'm going to come talk to you. Hey, your tree fruits whatever I need. Instead, I'm going to take it over. Let's talk it out. But if you're in a state of war, I'm going to kill you for it.
Yes, excellent. Kaylee, did you want to jump in?
Yeah. There was a part it's on the first page where he says at the thus men have no pleasure, but on the contrary, a great deal of grief in keeping company where there is no power able to overawe them all. And so he's basically like it's chaos and there's nothing. He's basically saying there should be nothing enjoyable for you that is coming from this. There is no pleasure that you get in having to survive every time you go outside, having to kill and take things from other people to survive. Like there's no pleasure in that.
Yeah, for
Would it
sure.
would it be like a Mad Max world? Like think the movie Mad Max, how everything is just chaos and rape and pillage and take what I want versus where we live now.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Yeah, because Hobbes is thinking, he's imagining, right? He's not been there, but he's imagining that humans are very selfish, right? And they're competitive and they're greedy. And to Juan's point, right? Like if I get hungry and Juan's been cultivating corn, all summer, I'm going to just go steal some corn. Well, by the year 2, Juan's going to figure out I'm not going to grow any corn because then my neighbors are just going to take it. So now none of us have corn, right? So if we're stealing things, if we're insecure, like mentally insecure, physically insecure, right? He famously says, I think I have the quote, life is nasty, brutish, and short, right? That's Hobbes, because he says, this is what life is like. Life with no government is a nightmare. It's a horrible dystopian, all for one. Everyone for themselves, right? Competitive, insecure. And therefore, because of that, humans can't have any good ideas, right? We can't ever do the things like Imam Sinar does. Like we can't build a beautiful dome, right? We can't come together for projects. We can't have art. We can't have agriculture. We can't invent machines, right? Because we can't sit still and stop fighting long enough to get anything done. So for him, the worst case scenario is that chaos moment where no one's in charge, which he lived through with the Civil War. So he knows of what he speaks. So he has a pessimistic view of human nature, and he feels like government is the answer. And so in a way, he wants to say people come together, right? Because we need protection from each other, right? So we're in classroom 101. Let's imagine, right, Tedesco's class in 102. Like we want protection from me and Juan fighting over the corn, but we also don't want to be invaded by Tedesco's class across the hall. So we're going to protect, like a police force, we're going to protect ourselves from each other and also from outsiders. And that's the only way we can thrive. That's why we come together to make a government. So therefore, Hobbes is less interested in who is in charge. He just wants there to be a ruler. What do you imagine happens if we have a ruler that's a giveaway? If we have a ruler that we don't like, let's say we all come together and we decide Reagan's going to be our queen. And like 1 week into her tenure, she's decided that anybody with brown hair can't come to class anymore. And we're all going to fail the class, right? For Hobbes, Reagan can do whatever she wants, and we all have to follow it, because the worst thing is to try to depose Reagan and try to find, then we'll be in disorder again, right? So Hobbes becomes an apologist for absolutism, because he basically says you make this contract, right? And there is no good reason to break it. You don't have a right to be in history class. So therefore, if she expels you from it, that's fine, because she can see things we can't see. She can understand things we can't understand, right? She's part of, because the chaos level at which we're going to descend is so much worse than whatever one bad monarch or one bad decision. Like Hobbes feels like, wouldn't it have been better if we didn't have that civil war? What if everyone just let the king do the stupid tax thing he wanted, right? Was it really going to be so bad compared to the tens of thousands of people who died in that civil war? Just pay the higher taxes. Do you see his point? You don't have to agree with him. And the American founding fathers do not agree with him. But he's a really important thinker that is like one of the foundational architects, right, of thinking about social contract theory. All right, let me look at the chats. Yes, thank you. Okay, those are good. Yeah, so yeah, no coups, no revolutions. For Hobbes, there is no excuse. You're a traitor, right? Okay, so that's Hobbes, who you're probably less familiar with than Locke, because Locke is our guy. For Americans, Locke is on the founding fathers' bedside table. That's what they're reading. So Locke is writing the same century, but later. And the excerpt you guys read was from the Second Treatise on Government, which is among his most famous writings. And he hasn't lived through the Civil War. He's lived through a second political moment where the king was threatening to have the king had a son that was being raised Roman Catholic, and there'd been a lot of fighting about religion in England, and they were firmly Protestant by then. And so Locke lives through this moment where the parliament says to the king, you know what, we don't want you to be king anymore because we don't want your son to be king. And the king fusses a little bit, but basically he just leaves. And his daughter comes in from a first marriage, William and Mary. She's married to William. And she comes in, and it was this very peaceful transfer of power. So Locke reads Hobbes, Locke thinks about human nature, and he comes to really different conclusions. Locke is much more optimistic about life in the state of nature, that humans are actually pretty good. It's not Mad Max at all. But sometimes I do accidentally take Juan's corn. I don't mean to, and but wouldn't it be better if we had if we had a place we could register where our land began and ended? Wouldn't that help? If we had more clear rules, we knew who the authority was. That will help us thrive even more, right? So Locke isn't quite so pessimistic as Hobbes. Government helps improve life, but life is not intolerable without it. Can you guys just nod or thumbs up if that so far makes sense? Sorry, thank you. I know I'm going fast. I just want to make sure. I had a vision that we'd be out of class so fast today. That was a bad vision. Okay, so therefore, for Locke, the function of coming together is like what I mentioned, right? Is to improve relations, to make things even smoother, even better, to keep me and Juan from ever fighting, because we'll know exactly where our land begins and ends, or whatever. And Locke thinks about what we really want is there's a few fundamental things we want government to protect, right? We want government to protect us, yes, but we're making this agreement with the government. And Locke conceives of, he doesn't invent this idea, right? But he magnifies it. This idea of natural rights. Life in the state of nature is, what are you really like? Natural rights are, what are your rights just by the nature of being born? Locke imagines that all humans have rights. Cave people, babies, and babies in the Ottoman Empire, right? And babies in Kangshi's China, and babies in England in the 1600s, right? They're going to grow up and they have a right to, do you guys know the list, right? Life, liberty, and property. Those are Locke's natural rights. That everybody, regardless of the government, right? That you've come together to form a government to protect your life, like Hobbes said, right? But also Locke's really interested in property, right? Having those runs more smooth. So you don't want a government that's going to take away your property and also your liberty. Because why would you give away your independence? Yes, you've got to give up some ability to murder your neighbors, right? But your fundamental liberty, right? Your individual freedoms, that's what government's supposed to protect. And so you can imagine if we pick Reagan as our queen, I'm sorry now to make you the bad guy again. But Reagan's our queen, right? And when she starts to make declarations like everyone with brown hair has to leave the classroom, Locke and Locke's followers, people who read Locke, right? Locke's going to say, let's break this contract with Reagan, right? We thought we had a contract. We came together and we said, as long as you protect us, Reagan, you can be our leader. We want this system. And now you're breaking it. So move to France, move to room 104, right? We don't want you here anymore because you've broken the contract, right? So now we need to find a new leader who's going to actually protect our life, liberty, and property. And so the idea is that they're both looking at a similar system. The government is a contract, but for Hobbes, it's really hard to break. For Locke, you break it if someone breaks your natural rights. I think that's my last slide. Let me stop sharing and talk with you guys for a minute about that. Okay, Hobbes seems completely focused. Yeah, maintain the status quo. Yeah, Tyson, you're exactly right. Thank you. And this is why Hobbes becomes an apologist for absolutism. It could also be an apology for democracy, right? If the democracy isn't working either, Hobbes still doesn't want you to break it. He just wants continuity. He's very afraid of chaos, of breaking the system. Locke is much more interested in supporting what might be thought of as rebels or traitors, right? And he says, no, you're just trying to get what you wanted out of that contract. Reflections, thoughts on the Locke and Hobbes bit? Okay, Reagan's question is in the chat about who gets to break the contract. So this is a really important idea. The social contract is among all of us. Remember, the ruler and the ruled. There's two parties to the contract for both Locke and Hobbes. The ruler agrees, Queen Reagan agrees, right? I'll provide you guys order and stability and blah, blah, blah. And in exchange, you'll give up some of your freedoms to me. And so Hobbes says, now you've made this contract. What's the point of a contract if it can be broken? That doesn't make any sense. Locke says you've made a contract that's only in existence as long as natural rights are protected. As soon as the ruler or the system, the rulers, right, doesn't have to be one person, but as soon as the entity in charge, the sovereign, that's the term that Hobbes uses, which is a good one, the sovereign, the power. As soon as the sovereign isn't protecting your natural rights, Locke says it's okay to break it. So you see how the Americans, right, are children of Locke. They've read Locke. We change the natural rights, right? What are our natural rights?
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Right, yeah, a little less crass, but like still there. So yeah, so they're looking at this formula, right? And so and when you guys read the French Revolution document, you know, you'll see they've got another list of what natural rights are, right? So how do you conceive of what does it mean to be human and what do humans get? I mean, I think maybe it depends on what you haven't been getting. But yeah, so the people can break the contract. Does everybody have to agree? You know, probably not, right? So the American revolutionaries, there were still some people that were loyal to the British crown in the revolution, but that Locke would say, okay, they're justified in saying you're not giving us what we need. I set you guys up with all that because I want you to know there's a lot of apologists for absolutism, a lot of people who say this is a great system, it works, it's strong, it's majestic, right? But we've also got some real-time models in the 1600s in England, especially, of people saying, I don't know how great it is to be ruled by somebody who has all the power. We think there should be limits on their power. And even farther, right, these theorists that say we think we can break with our government and change our government, which is going to be the big story of the late 1700s. So 100 years after, you know, Locke is writing, you know, we're going to get a 50-year period with massive revolutions, you know, across the Atlantic world. Okay, I think that's everything. Final questions or thoughts?
So I got a question. So you were saying that the people come together and they make this deal with the government. I give you this, you give us this. So at what point is decided, because obviously there's, you know, millions of people, hundreds of thousands, whatever the society is, how do you get together and at what point does it form, like your congressman, hey, I'm representing these people, they want this, versus the masses want this, but then they really don't. And then at the end, you get this system where it comes to this one person, I want this, but the people do, but they really don't. How do you define who's in charge of that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I'm going to make you all work through that when we do the French Revolution game, because it's a real problem, right? For all governments, right? Who speaks for the people, right? And how do we measure that even today, right? How do we measure that? I think Locke and Hobbes are they're not leaders. They're not even politicians. They're political scientists, right? They're philosophers, political philosophers. And so their whole thing is an imaginary construct. Like they're imagining there was an agreement. They know cave people didn't really come together and like sign a piece of paper to agree to have a government. But they're saying, if we're going to think about why government exists, right? Is it doing what we would have set out for it to do? But you're right. I think it gets hazy and blurry in a lot of gray areas as we go forward. And that's, I think, once revolution starts to become thinkable, right? Then there starts to become more sense of overthrowing whoever thinks they're in charge. I think the last point on Juan's thing is also there's a sense of scale, right? If we're talking about just the 45 of us in room 101, right? Our ability I'm the absolute monarch there, but like our ability to rule versus the whole college campus versus our whole university versus all of Georgia. But, you know, like I think you're right that there's a scale sense that changes. Okay, liberalism, yeah, liberalism like pure liberty. Tyson's talking about also. So we'll talk more as we get going. I just wanted to introduce you guys to that today. Let me just one final visual aid, which is that for Thursday, my guess is we're still going to be on Zoom. We'll see. But I want you guys, I'm trying to minimize that. Yeah, on Thursday, I don't know if you guys can there. Just download another document. If we're in class, that would be great. If there's still ice and snow on the ground, you know, save yourself. If we're home, I have some AI stuff I want to do. So I think we'll find something interesting to do if we're still off on Thursday. But if you have questions, reach out on chat, send me an email. I'm also happy to stay afterwards and talk. But I'll let the rest of you guys hop off and stay warm and dry and don't drive anywhere. I'll see you guys. Thank you.